gray waters west of Luzon. On the bridge, a Philippine Navy officer picks up the radio. He transmits a challenge, not a threat, not a warning shot, just a firm, professional message to a Chinese naval frigate operating nearby.
To PLA Navy Warship 555 on course 353 at vicinity 13 nautical miles southwest of Palawig Point, Zambales. This is Philippine Navy Warship 7. In accordance with international and Philippine national laws, you are sailing within Philippine Exclusive Economic Zone. You are requested to provide your intention and last and next port of call. Over.
4 times. No guns fired. No collision. No confrontation in the dramatic Hollywood sense. And yet, what happened near Bajo de Masinloc, better known to the world as Scarborough Shoal, was quietly significant. It was a glimpse of something that was almost unthinkable just a decade ago. The Philippine Navy going on the offensive, in its own waters, against the world's second-largest military power. The ship carrying out those radio challenges was BRP Diego Silang. And the story of this one warship, and this one patrol, tells us something much larger about what is changing in the South China Sea. This warship will add to the capital ships of the Philippine Navy that are capable of patrolling all the way up to our EEZ, and even beyond. Rear Admiral Roy Vincent Trinidad, Philippine Navy spokesperson for the West Philippine Sea. Scarborough Shoal sits about 120 nautical miles west of Luzon. Under international law, specifically the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, it falls squarely inside the Philippines' 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone. Manila has legal rights there. The problem is that since 2012, China has controlled it in practice.
菲律宾3016船，这里是中国海警3305舰。
During a routine patrol in the area, BRP Diego Silang encountered a layered Chinese presence, a People's Liberation Army Navy frigate identified as Hull 555, a China Coast Guard vessel, and a Chinese research vessel, all operating nearby. The Philippine crew issued 4 formal radio challenges, standard naval procedure used to establish identity, assert jurisdictional awareness, and create an official record of the encounter. What makes this significant is not what the crew said over the radio. It is what their actions represented.
This is Philippine Navy Warship 7. In accordance with international and Philippine national laws, you are within Philippine Exclusive Economic Zone, over which Philippines has sovereignty. Your actions are illegal and will be reported and will prejudice our country's relations. Over.
For years, the dominant pattern in the West Philippine Sea followed one script: China acts, the Philippines reacts. Chinese vessels entered Filipino waters, Philippine ships responded, protested through diplomatic channels, or simply observed. The whole dynamic was shaped by who held the initiative. The Diego Silang patrol suggests that script is being rewritten. Pay close attention to the mix of Chinese vessels present that day. This was not accidental. China rarely shows up with just one type of ship. Instead, it deploys overlapping layers, a research vessel, to collect data and establish civilian presence, a China Coast Guard ship, to project law enforcement authority and legal ambiguity, a PLAN warship. To provide military weight behind the civilian-looking operation, this layered approach is a deliberate strategy, often described by analysts as gray zone competition. It lets China apply pressure without triggering open military confrontation. The Coast Guard provides plausible deniability. The naval frigate provides the muscle if needed. Together, they dominate an area without firing a single shot. By challenging that PLAN frigate directly, BRP Diego Silang was not just conducting a routine patrol. It was engaging the full depth of China's presence and refusing to be intimidated by it. To understand why this moment matters, you have to understand what the Diego Silang actually is and what it replaced. Not long ago, the Philippine Navy's front line in the West Philippine Sea consisted of aging patrol vessels, some of which were older than the officers commanding them. The 2012 Scarborough Shoal standoff exposed this painful reality. China moved in with superior numbers and superior ships. The Philippines had no answer. It lost the shoal, not through war, but through the simple reality of capability gaps. The national trauma of 2012 forced a reckoning. The Philippines launched a naval modernization drive that has been accelerating ever since. In December 2021, Manila signed a $477 million contract with South Korea's HD Hyundai Heavy Industries for 2 guided missile frigates. BRP Diego Silang is the second of these, commissioned on December 2, 2025, at Naval Operating Base Subic in Zambales. The specifications tell part of the story. Length, 118.4 meters, longer than a football field displacement, 3,200 tons. The largest class the Philippine Navy has ever operated, speed, up to 25 knots, with a range of 4,500 nautical miles. Weapons, 16-cell vertical launch system for air defense missiles, anti-ship cruise missiles, torpedoes, and a close-in weapon system for last-ditch defense sensors. Advanced AESA radar for tracking multiple threats simultaneously, but raw specifications only go so far. The deeper significance is what this ship can do that older Philippine vessels could not: stay at sea longer, see farther, communicate more reliably, and project confidence in contested waters far from the Philippine coastline. Diego Silang sends a clear message that the Philippines will continue to invest in programs that strengthen maritime domain awareness, enhance deterrence, and improve our ability to uphold the rule of law. Defense Undersecretary Salvador Melchor Maison Jr. There is a simple truth that military PLANers often state: confidence comes from capability. A crew operating a modern, reliable warship behaves differently than one on an aging vessel that may struggle to complete a patrol. When sailors trust their ship's sensors and communications, they are more willing to hold their ground. When commanders know they can sustain operations over distance and time, they authorize more missions. The Diego Silang patrol is evidence of exactly this dynamic. The crew did not issue 4 radio challenges to a Chinese naval frigate by accident or out of recklessness. They did so because they had the platform, the training, and the institutional confidence to do it, professionally, calmly, and on the record. Hardware explains part of the story. But the Philippine Navy's growing confidence did not emerge from ships alone. Behind every patrol in the West Philippine Sea stands a web of partnerships that has quietly transformed Manila's strategic position. The U.S.-Philippines alliance has deepened significantly in recent years. Under the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, the number of Philippine bases accessible to American forces expanded from 5 to 9 in 2023. Washington has repeatedly made clear that armed attacks against Philippine public vessels or armed forces in the South China Sea could trigger U.S. mutual defense obligations. The financial dimension is equally significant. In December 2025, the U.S. Congress approved $2.5 billion in new security assistance for the Philippines, $500 million per year from 2026 through 2030. This is not vague diplomatic language. It is locked-in funding for equipment, training, and capability. Earlier, the Trump administration exempted $336 million in Philippine military modernization assistance from its foreign aid freeze. A quiet but clear statement of commitment. For Philippine commanders at sea, this matters. A navy that knows it has reliable diplomatic and material backing from the world's most powerful military simply behaves differently than one that feels entirely alone. Japan has become one of the Philippines' most important maritime partners, providing patrol vessels, radar systems, maritime surveillance assistance, and capacity-building programs that directly improve Manila's ability to monitor its own waters. In July 2024, the Philippines signed a landmark reciprocal access agreement with Tokyo, the first such agreement Japan has ever concluded with a Southeast Asian nation. Australia has stepped up too. In February 2026, just weeks before the Diego Silang patrol, the navies of the Philippines, Australia, and the United States held joint maritime exercises in waters between Subic Bay and Bajo de Masinloc, the very area where the Diego Silang later challenged Chinese forces. It was the first multilateral exercise BRP Diego Silang participated in. The symbolism was hard to miss. This expanding web of partnerships creates something that no single ship can: strategic depth. China may still dominate the South China Sea in raw numbers, but increasingly, any action it takes there is observed, documented, and discussed by a growing coalition of nations with shared interests in freedom of navigation and rules-based order.
830 yards, distance 151.
Here is something that rarely gets the attention it deserves. The most effective weapon the Philippines has deployed in the West Philippine Sea might not be a frigate, a missile, or a Coast Guard vessel. It might be a camera. The Philippines has made a deliberate, strategic choice to publicize its maritime encounters. Radio challenges get released. Footage of Chinese water cannon attacks gets distributed. Radar tracks of aggressive Chinese maneuvers get handed to journalists. Every documented incident becomes part of a growing evidentiary record. Think about what that does in practical terms. Gray zone competition, the kind China practices, relies on ambiguity. When actions go undocumented, they can be denied, minimized, or spun. When they are recorded and distributed, ambiguity disappears. The Diego Silang encounter illustrates this perfectly. 4 radio challenges, on their own, are a routine naval procedure. Published, documented, and placed in the public record, they become evidence that a Philippine warship was actively asserting its nation's sovereign rights in contested waters, while a Chinese PLAN frigate was present without invitation. This is not just public relations. In maritime disputes, documentation builds the kind of international legitimacy that shapes diplomatic support, attracts allied attention, and strengthens a country's hand in multilateral forums. Smaller states rarely win against larger powers through brute military force. They win, or at least hold their ground, by accumulating credibility, sustaining presence, and keeping the world watching. Step back from this single patrol, and a larger picture comes into focus. The Philippines is not simply buying new ships and hoping for the best. Under President Ferdinand Marcos Jr., Manila has adopted a fundamentally different approach to the West Philippine Sea, one built on persistent presence rather than episodic response. The old pattern was this.
This is China Coast Guard Vessel 5201.
China does something provocative. Manila protests. Tensions spike. Then things quiet down until the next incident. The Philippines was always reacting to someone else's moves. The new pattern looks different. Philippine vessels, Navy, Coast Guard, and fishing fleets operating under government protection are maintaining near-continuous presence in contested areas. Patrols are no longer emergency responses to crises. They are the routine. Consider what has been happening on the defense budget front. Manila submitted a proposal to raise its defense spending for fiscal year 2026 to roughly $5.2 billion, a 16% increase over 2025, which itself rose 14% from 2024. This marks the 3rd consecutive year of double-digit growth in military spending. South Korea has been contracted to deliver 12 ships at a cost of more than $5 billion. France's OCEA has a $450 million deal to provide 40 patrol boats for the Philippine Coast Guard. Discussions are underway for 2 additional frigates and, remarkably, a submarine capability, something the Philippine Navy has never had. The Philippines has also approved a multi-year $35 billion defense modernization program. These numbers signal something beyond routine procurement. They represent a national decision that passive observation is no longer an acceptable strategy. The logic driving this is straightforward, even if the execution is complex. Maritime rights, under international law, are not just claimed, they are exercised. A country that stays out of its own exclusive economic zone, even if it possesses legal rights there, effectively cedes that space to whoever does show up. The 2016 arbitral ruling at The Hague invalidated China's expansive claims in the South China Sea. That legal victory was enormously significant, but it did not change a single thing on the water. China ignored the ruling and continued its operations. Manila learned that legal victories must be backed by practical, visible activity to have any real effect. BRP Diego Silang, challenging a Chinese naval frigate with 4 radio transmissions near Scarborough Shoal, is what that lesson looks like in practice. This is not a story with a simple happy ending. Greater confidence and more frequent patrols also mean more frequent close encounters. And close encounters carry risk, even when both sides intend to keep things professional. On August 11, 2025, the world got a vivid reminder of how quickly things can escalate. A China Coast Guard vessel and a PLAN warship collided with each other while pursuing a Philippine Coast Guard patrol vessel near Scarborough Shoal. The Chinese government blamed the Philippines. Manila released video evidence showing what actually happened. 3 Chinese personnel were reported killed. No Philippine sailors were harmed. But the encounter showed how rapidly a routine patrol can become an international incident. The risk of miscalculation at sea is real and persistent. A misunderstood radio transmission, an overly aggressive local commander, or an unexpected maneuver in close quarters can transform a manageable situation into something neither side wanted. There is also the question of whether Manila can sustain this posture over the long term. Maintaining near-continuous presence across a 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone is expensive. Ships need fuel, maintenance, spare parts, and rested crews. China can field far larger numbers of vessels and rotate them continuously without the same strain on its budget. The Philippines does not have that luxury, which is precisely why the alliance relationships, particularly the $2.5 billion US commitment, matter so much. They extend what Manila can do on its own. The balance the Philippines is trying to strike is delicate, assertive enough to defend its rights, disciplined enough to avoid handing Beijing a pretext for escalation. Too little presence, and China fills the vacuum. Too much pressure, and the risk of a serious incident grows. It is a narrow line to walk. But the evidence suggests Manila is walking it with increasing skill. Let us return to where we started. A Philippine warship, a radio, and 4 transmissions to a Chinese naval frigate near Scarborough Shoal. On the surface, nothing dramatic happened. No weapons fired. No ships collided. No immediate crisis. Just 4 professional radio challenges between naval forces in contested waters. But look beneath the surface, and the picture is remarkable. A ship that did not exist 18 months ago, built in South Korea, armed with French missiles and Turkish close-in weapons, funded through a contract signed in the shadow of Chinese aggression, sailing confidently into one of Asia's most disputed maritime spaces and asserting, without flinching, that these waters belong to the Philippines. Behind that ship stands a navy in transformation, backed by $2.5 billion in committed U.S. support, deepening partnerships with Japan and Australia, a defense budget growing at double-digit rates, and a national consensus that the days of passive observation are over. The Philippines is not trying to match China's military power. It is doing something more strategic, making itself impossible to ignore, too costly to coerce, and too transparent to dismiss. The BRP Diego Silang did not change the balance of power in the South China Sea with 4 radio challenges. But it contributed to something that, over time, might matter just as much. The gradual, cumulative normalization of Philippine presence in waters that international law already recognizes as theirs. In maritime disputes, sovereignty is not just declared, it is exercised. And the Philippines is finally exercising it, loudly, visibly, and persistently.
Get out there!
What does it mean when a state stops calling harassment harassment and starts calling it piracy? That single word choice, loaded with centuries of legal, moral, and strategic weight, is what made the latest confrontation at Second Thomas Shoal fundamentally different from the dozens of incidents that preceded it. When the Philippines publicly accused China of piracy following a violent encounter in the South China Sea, it was not merely describing an event at sea. It was signaling a shift in narrative, posture, and possibly escalation thresholds. The incident itself followed a now familiar pattern. Philippine vessels conducting a resupply mission to Second Thomas Shoal were confronted by Chinese maritime forces employing aggressive maneuvering, boarding actions, and the seizure of equipment. Such encounters have occurred repeatedly in recent years. What changed was Manila's framing. By invoking piracy, a term rooted in international law and historically associated with criminal violence beyond state authority, the Philippines implicitly challenged Beijing's attempt to normalize coercion under the guise of law enforcement and sovereignty patrols. This rhetorical escalation matters because language shapes legitimacy. Most Southeast Asian states facing pressure from China have relied on calibrated, cautious phrasing. Unsafe maneuvers, incidents, or miscalculations. Vietnam has protested. Malaysia has quietly reinforced. Indonesia has renamed waters and strengthened patrols, all while avoiding labels that could legally or diplomatically harden positions. By contrast, the Philippines has increasingly chosen clarity over ambiguity. Calling an act piracy reframes the encounter from a bilateral dispute into a question of international order, rules at sea, and collective response. Strategically, the episode fits squarely within China's established pattern of gray zone maritime coercion. The deliberate use of Coast Guard, maritime militia, and quasi-civilian assets to apply force without crossing the threshold of declared armed conflict. What makes this case distinct is how it intersects with alliance dynamics.
Our mutual defense treaty is the bedrock of that. We share concerns about China's coercion in the South China Sea.
Unlike many regional states, the Philippines operates under a formal mutual defense treaty with the United States, conducts regular joint patrols, and has openly aligned its maritime posture with broader Indo-Pacific deterrence efforts. The piracy accusation, therefore, resonates far beyond the reef itself, raising questions about precedent, escalation control, and how far coercion can go before it triggers collective security mechanisms. In that sense, Second Thomas Shoal is no longer just a rusting ship on a submerged reef. It has become a test case of narrative power, of legal framing, and of whether sustained gray zone pressure can still hide behind technicalities when the language of international crime enters the conversation. At the heart of the latest South China Sea confrontation lies Second Thomas Shoal, also called Ayungin Shoal by the Philippines. A low-lying reef roughly 105 nautical miles west of Palawan that sits well within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone, EEZ, as defined under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5 tayo.
Manila has maintained a permanent presence there since 1999 by grounding the aging transport BRP Sierra Madre to reinforce its territorial claim, a symbolic fixture of sovereignty that China continues to contest.
There was a RORE mission to BRP Sierra Madre. No untoward incident. There were 4 Coast Guard ships of China that were spotted, but they did not do any coercive nor aggressive actions.
On June 17, 2024, a routine rotation and reprovisioning RORE mission by the Armed Forces of the Philippines, AFP, to deliver food, water, and other supplies to personnel aboard Sierra Madre devolved into violence when Chinese Coast Guard vessels aggressively intervened. According to the Philippines, Chinese personnel boarded at least one Philippine boat using cutlasses, spears, and knives, forcing Filipino sailors to defend themselves without firearms, per operational orders.
Tropa natin yan?
Manila reports that 8 Filipino personnel were wounded during the clash, including one sailor who lost his right thumb amid the melee. Philippine military leadership did not mince words.
The Coast Guard ang nag-rescue sa ating mga wounded personnel. Sila rin nagbigay ng first aid.
AFP Chief General Romeo Bronner Jr. publicly characterized the episode as akin to piracy, stating that Chinese personnel had seized 7 rifles still boxed for delivery and damaged communications and navigational equipment on the Filipino vessels. In a formal demand to Beijing, Manila later insisted on 60 million Filipino pesos in compensation for the equipment loss and the injury sustained by Seaman First Class Jeffrey Facundo, whose medical care for the severed digit was part of the total cost estimate. From Manila's perspective, the weapons involved were not firearms, but bladed or improvised handheld implements used by Chinese forces during boarding, showing the irregular and brazen nature of the clash that triggered Manila's piracy label. Beijing, however, offered a sharply different account, rejecting Manila's narrative as distorted and insisting that Chinese actions were reasonable, lawful, professional, and restrained, even as its Coast Guard continued patrols in contested areas. In the immediate aftermath, the Philippine Coast Guard and Navy bolstered their presence around Second Thomas Shoal, deploying additional vessels and conducting more frequent patrols to deter further interference. Moves the AFP described as necessary to uphold navigation rights and protect Filipino personnel operating in waters Manila considers sovereign.
Unidentified foreign vessel at Sabina Shoal. This is Philippine Coast Guard. BRP Cabra MRRV 4409.
This incident did not occur in isolation. It fits into a broader pattern of maritime confrontations between the two countries, ranging from water cannon engagements against Filipino fishing boats in December 2025 to repeated blocking and collision incidents near Scarborough Shoal and other contested features of the South China Sea. To understand why tensions keep boiling over at Second Thomas Shoal, you have to stop thinking of it as just a reef on a map. It sits inside the Spratly Islands, one of the most hotly contested island systems in the world, and just a short distance from major sea lanes that carry trillions of dollars in trade through the South China Sea every year. Control here is not symbolic. It shapes who watches, who moves, and who decides what is normal at sea. For the Philippines, the shoal is deeply personal. Since 1999, Manila has maintained a constant presence through the grounded BRP Sierra Madre, a rusting World War II-era vessel deliberately run aground and turned into a living outpost. Filipino Marines rotate through harsh conditions, relying on periodic resupply missions for food, water, and medicine. Every successful run is quiet proof that the Philippines is still there. Every blocked mission feels like a test of resolve. That is where the pattern begins. Time after time, Chinese vessels have attempted to block, shadow, or physically disrupt Philippine resupply efforts. These are rarely dramatic naval battles. Instead, they unfold as tense standoffs at close range, ships cutting across bows, engines throttling forward, horns blaring, crews shouting across decks. The objective is not to sink a ship, but to exhaust, intimidate, and normalize interference without firing a shot.
Sa ngayon, nagbuga na naman ng tubig ang water cannon.
Since 2021, the Philippine Coast Guard has done something unusual in maritime disputes. It has turned cameras outward. Video after video released by the PCG shows Chinese vessels using water cannons, executing dangerous close-quarter maneuvers, and deliberately obstructing Philippine boats on humanitarian and military resupply missions. These clips matter because they strip away abstraction. You see sailors knocked off balance by high-pressure water jets. You hear engines straining as hulls pass within meters of collision. It is pressure made visible.
Hey! Stop! Hey! Stop! 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 Get out there!
What makes Second Thomas Shoal different from other disputed features is repetition. This is not a one-off crisis that fades from headlines. It is a cycle. Resupply planned, interference anticipated, confrontation likely. Each encounter builds on the last, slowly raising stakes while testing how much friction can be applied before something snaps. Over time, the shoal has evolved from a static claim into a living stress test of endurance, credibility, and deterrence in the South China Sea. In short, Second Thomas Shoal is not dangerous because of what it is, but because of what keeps happening there, again and again, in plain sight. Under international law, piracy has a very specific meaning. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea defines it as violent acts committed for private ends on the high seas, typically by non-state actors, classic criminals, not uniformed personnel flying a national flag. By that strict definition, confrontations involving state-affiliated forces usually fall outside the legal box labeled piracy. That is where the complexity and the intent comes in. When Chinese Coast Guard or maritime personnel act under state authority, their actions are normally classified as law enforcement activity, however aggressive or disputed. Legally speaking, that makes the Philippines' piracy label difficult to sustain in a courtroom sense. But Manila was not arguing a case before judges. It was speaking to an audience far larger than any tribunal. In practice, the term piracy functions less as a legal charge and more as a strategic signal. It strips away technical language and reframes the incident in moral terms that are immediately understood. Violence at sea, seizure of property, injury to sailors. It challenges the idea that such behavior can be dismissed as routine patrols or administrative enforcement. In one word, the Philippines recast coercion as criminality. The objective is clear. By using language that resonates beyond bilateral diplomacy, Manila seeks to internationalize the incident, to push it out of the narrow frame of a Philippines-China dispute and into the broader conversation about maritime norms, freedom of navigation, and acceptable conduct at sea. Whether or not piracy holds up legally, it succeeds rhetorically by forcing the world to ask a sharper question. When does enforcement stop looking like law and start looking like force? China rarely leads with gray holes and naval guns. Instead, it sends white ships. The primary instruments of pressure in contested waters are not the Navy, but the China Coast Guard and a vast network of maritime militia. Vessels that look civilian, behave aggressively, and operate in the space between peace and war. This is not accidental, it is design. The tactics are now well established. Chinese vessels block approaches, shadow targets at close range, board foreign boats, interfere with equipment, and maintain a constant presence that wears opponents down over time. These encounters are calibrated to stay just below the threshold that would justify a military response, while still imposing real physical and psychological pressure on crews at sea. No missiles, no declarations, just relentless friction. This approach is backed by scale. The China Coast Guard operates the largest Coast Guard fleet in the world, including multiple megacutters exceeding 10,000 tons, larger than many countries' frigates. Their size is not just symbolic. It allows Chinese ships to intimidate smaller vessels simply by proximity, to absorb collisions, and to dominate contested spaces without ever firing a shot. Presence becomes power. For years, Manila tried quiet diplomacy. It avoided cameras, softened language, and handled incidents through back channels. That approach has now clearly changed. The Philippines has embraced transparency as a tool of defense, publicly releasing incident footage, photographs, and detailed briefings after confrontations at sea. By showing what its crews face in real time, Manila is no longer asking the world to take its word. It is putting evidence on the table. This shift did not happen in a vacuum. The loss of effective access to Scarborough Shoal in 2012 was a turning point. Filipino fishermen were gradually pushed out, patrols were blocked, and control slipped without a single shot being fired. That experience left a lasting imprint on policymakers and the public alike. silence and ambiguity did not preserve access. Visibility mattered. Operationally, the response has been steady rather than dramatic. The Philippine Coast Guard and Navy have increased patrol frequency in contested waters, while the armed forces of the Philippines have expanded maritime domain awareness, using radar, satellite tracking, aerial surveillance, and allied information sharing to reduce blind spots at sea. The goal is simple but critical. Know who is where, doing what, and record it. Public opinion has moved in parallel. Repeated national surveys show consistently high domestic support for defending maritime claims and for closer security cooperation with allies, particularly the United States. For many Filipinos, the issue is no longer abstract geopolitics. It is about fishermen blocked from traditional grounds, sailors injured on routine missions, and sovereignty tested in plain sight. The Philippine response reflects a hard-earned lesson. Deterrence is not only about ships and treaties, it is about narrative control, persistence, and public backing. By pairing transparency with steady operational pressure, Manila is signaling that it will no longer manage maritime disputes quietly, and that endurance, not silence, now defines its posture. For the Philippines, every confrontation at sea now carries an alliance calculation. The Mutual Defense Treaty with the United States has existed for more than 7 decades, but its relevance has never felt more immediate. In 2023 to 2024, Washington repeatedly and explicitly reaffirmed that the treaty applies to armed attacks on Philippine forces in the South China Sea, including Coast Guard and public vessels. That clarity matters. It narrows gray areas and raises the cost of miscalculation. Cooperation has followed rhetoric. The two allies now conduct joint patrols, expand intelligence sharing, and operate under widened access arrangements through the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. Importantly, this is not about permanent U.S. bases. The emphasis is on rotational presence, interoperability, and speed, being able to operate together seamlessly when pressure rises. Deterrence here is subtle, not a flag planted, but a signal constantly reinforced. Across Southeast Asia, the Philippines is being watched closely. Other claimant states, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, understand that what happens to Philippine vessels today could happen to theirs tomorrow. The concern is not a single clash, but the normalization of coercion. Aggressive actions slowly becoming routine, unremarkable, and therefore tolerated. Yet regional responses remain constrained. ASEAN operates on consensus, a structure that prizes unity but limits decisive collective action. As a result, responses tend to be cautious, fragmented, and national rather than regional. This creates a dangerous gap where pressure accumulates at sea faster than institutions can respond. The risk is not sudden war, but incremental escalation, one low-level confrontation at a time. Beijing has categorically rejected the Philippines' accusations. Its position is consistent and carefully maintained. Chinese forces are operating within what China claims as its maritime jurisdiction, while Philippine missions are framed as deliberate provocations. In this narrative, China is enforcing order. Others are destabilizing it. Equally consistent is Beijing's opposition to external involvement. The United States in particular is portrayed as an outside agitator, turning local disputes into strategic flashpoints. This is not just diplomacy, it is information warfare. Competing narratives are aimed at different audiences: reassurance at home, justification regionally, and deflection internationally. Control of the story is treated as seriously as control of the sea. The most dangerous factor in the South China Sea today is proximity. Ships maneuver within meters. Crews interact face-to-face. Tensions play out in real time, often without robust incident prevention or crisis management mechanisms to slow things down. In gray zone operations, ambiguity is a feature, but it is also a liability. The risks are painfully human. An injury, a collision, a panicked reaction, an improvised weapon used a second too late or too early. None of these require intent to escalate. They only require exhaustion, fear, or misjudgment. In such an environment, de-escalation becomes harder precisely because nothing officially counts as war. In the short term, pressure at Second Thomas Shoal is unlikely to ease. Philippine resupply missions will continue, and Chinese interference is likely to persist. Neither side can afford to blink without signaling weakness. In the medium term, Manila will lean even more heavily on alliance support, transparency, and legal diplomatic signaling. The goal is endurance, keeping claims alive, costs visible, and norms contested rather than surrendered. The long-term challenge is deeper. Can deterrence based on presence, publicity, and partnerships remain sustainable without binding regional enforcement mechanisms? Or does prolonged gray zone pressure eventually erode even the most carefully calibrated responses? The Second Thomas Shoal incident is not an anomaly. It is part of an entrenched pattern, one defined by repetition rather than rupture. The Philippines' use of the word piracy reflects a deliberate effort to reframe maritime coercion as a violation of shared international norms, not a manageable bilateral irritation. In that sense, Second Thomas Shoal has become a barometer. It shows how South China Sea disputes are likely to be managed in the years ahead, incrementally, persistently, and deliberately below the threshold of open conflict. What remains uncertain is how long that balance can hold, and who ultimately pays the price if it breaks.
If you like the video, do not forget to like, share, and subscribe our channel for deep analysis of contemporary issues.
The South China Sea, a vital artery of global trade, has once again become the stage for a dangerous confrontation. In August 2025, the unprecedented collision between a Chinese naval destroyer and a China Coast Guard vessel while attempting to block a Philippine ship turned a simmering dispute into a geopolitical powder keg. The Philippine mission was civilian-led, with the BRP Silang dispatched to Scarborough Shoal to assert sovereign rights and supply Filipino fishermen. What followed was a dramatic showdown, with Chinese ships employing reckless blocking maneuvers and water cannons, culminating in the stunning collision of China's own vessels. The aftermath exposed the inherent dangers of Beijing's gray zone tactics and the high-stakes environment in which even missteps can escalate into international crises. The numbers only sharpen the picture. The clash occurred just 10.5 nautical miles from Scarborough Shoal, well within the Philippines' 200 nautical mile EEZ, as affirmed by the 2016 Hague ruling.
Regardless of these numbers, the Philippine Navy remains fully on top of the situation, demonstrating continued heightened vigilance and sustained presence in our maritime domain. With our strengthened maritime domain awareness and interagency coordination, your Armed Forces of the Philippines assures the public of our continued commitment to asserting the nation's rights.
Chinese pressure is rising too. In June 2025, a record 49 Chinese vessels operated in 3 disputed areas, the highest monthly total of the year. With $5.3 trillion in annual trade flowing through the South China Sea, every collision and blockade reverberates far beyond Manila and Beijing. Experts warn that China's reckless behavior could spiral out of control, triggering wider crises, while Philippine officials have made their stance clear. amidst coercion and escalation, they will not back down. The ripple effects are already reshaping alliances and strategies. The Scarborough incident directly tested the U.S.-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty, and Washington responded swiftly, with U.S. Navy warships conducting freedom of navigation operations near the shoal. Yet reassurance comes with risk. Closer alliances also mean thinner margins for error. Instead of retreating after humiliation, China doubled down, swarming 2nd Thomas Shoal with Coast Guard, naval, and militia forces, hardening an escalation cycle that drags the region closer to the brink. Legally and diplomatically, however, the Philippines has gained ground. Every clash reaffirms the 2016 Hague ruling, giving Manila leverage to rally allies like the US, Japan, and Australia against Chinese coercion. Scarborough is no longer just a reef, it is evidence.
The August 2025 standoff at Scarborough Shoal is a microcosm of the entire South China Sea dispute. Reckless gray zone tactics, a test of international law, and a contest of wills between an underdog nation and a rising superpower. The path forward is fraught. China will likely seek to reassert dominance and save face, while Manila, backed by its allies, presses forward with assertive, civilian-led missions. The risk of miscalculation remains dangerously high. The South China Sea showdown is now a high-stakes game of chicken, with global consequences, and the world is watching. Will international law and collective resolve hold the line, or will coercion and unchecked ambition dictate the future of the Indo-Pacific? The August 2025 Scarborough Shoal standoff began not with warships, but with a mission of civilians. The Philippines dispatched the BRP Silang, a Philippine Coast Guard cutter, as the lead escort for a Kadiwa ng Bagong Bayaning Mangingisda, KBBM, mission, a supply and solidarity run meant to bring food, fuel, and essentials to Filipino fishermen working inside the country's exclusive economic zone. But this was more than charity. It was part of Manila's bold new strategy, not just to endure China's harassment, but to document and publicize it for the world to see. The fishermen aboard weren't just receiving rice and fuel, they were carrying a message of sovereignty. What awaited them at Scarborough was a wall of steel. Multiple China Coast Guard CCG cutters were already on station, shadowed by a People's Liberation Army Navy PLAN destroyer, the PLAN Guilin. The coordinated presence of China's Coast Guard and Navy was no accident. It's a signature of Beijing's gray zone tactics, a deliberate blurring of civilian law enforcement and military force, designed to intimidate while avoiding a formal declaration of war. Against the single Philippine cutter, China brought an armada. The harassment began almost immediately. Chinese vessels performed high-speed blocking maneuvers, swerving dangerously close to the BRP Silang in what sailors call shouldering and crossing the bow, tactics meant to intimidate and force a smaller vessel off course. Then came the familiar but dangerous weapon, a high-pressure water cannon blasting the Philippine cutter as it attempted to hold its line. The tension on deck was visible, every move filmed by PCG cameras as part of Manila's assertive transparency campaign. But then came the twist that shocked the world. In the chaos of repeated blocking attempts, the PLAN Guilin and one of the Chinese Coast Guard cutters, hull number 3104, both maneuvering aggressively to box in the BRP Silang, collided with each other. The crash was caught in full view of PCG cameras, two massive Chinese vessels slamming together in their own attempt at intimidation. The Coast Guard later called it a moment of fratricidal collision, an accident born of recklessness and poor seamanship. And while the Philippine cutter managed to escape unscathed, the Chinese ships were not so lucky. The aftermath was striking. The CCG cutter 3104 suffered serious bow damage, left unseaworthy, according to Philippine reports. Even more disturbing, PCG observers noted seeing 4 Chinese crew members on deck moments before impact, men who vanished after the collision, raising fears of casualties. Meanwhile, the Plan E destroyer, though also heavily damaged, made no attempt to render assistance to its stricken Coast Guard counterpart. To naval experts, this was more than negligence. It was a violation of centuries-old maritime tradition and a breach of international humanitarian norms. The world saw not a show of strength, but a breakdown of discipline. As footage of the collision spread, the narratives diverged sharply. The Philippines seized the moment, framing it as proof of both Chinese aggression and Chinese incompetence. PCG spokesperson Commodore J. Terriella took to the podium, calling it a case of poor seamanship by Chinese crews and praising the Suluan's skilled maneuvering. He highlighted that despite being the target of harassment, the Filipino crew had offered assistance to the damaged Chinese vessel, an offer ignored. For Manila, the story became a powerful propaganda victory, flipping Beijing's intimidation into a humiliation.
China, on the other hand, went silent. For 4 days, there was no official word, no acknowledgement of the footage flooding social media and news networks. Finally, Beijing's defense ministry broke its silence, not to admit the collision, but to accuse the Philippine vessel of dangerous maneuvering and illegally entering Chinese waters. Crucially, the statement never mentioned the crash between the PLAN destroyer and the CCG cutter, a glaring omission that revealed how sensitive Beijing was to the global perception of clumsiness and incompetence. For a country obsessed with projecting strength and control, the sight of its own ships colliding was a humiliation too big to admit. The August 2025 Scarborough Shoal standoff didn't happen in a gray, ambiguous patch of sea. It happened just 10.5 nautical miles from the shoal itself, deep inside the Philippines' 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone, EEZ. Under the 2016 Hague Tribunal ruling, that zone was legally affirmed as Philippine territory, invalidating China's sweeping 9-dash line. By any measure of international law, the Chinese vessels that boxed in the BRP Suluan were operating illegally. And that makes the collision between China's own ships not just a humiliation, but a violation playing out on the wrong side of the law. This was not an isolated encounter. It is part of a sharp upward trend. In June 2025, the Philippine Navy documented a record 49 Chinese vessels active across 3 separate disputed zones in just 1 month, the highest tally so far that year. It was a clear demonstration that Beijing's gray zone campaign is expanding in both scope and intensity. Each new flotilla, each new blockade brings with it a higher risk of confrontation and miscalculation. What used to be occasional standoffs are becoming routine pressure tests, wearing down Manila's resources and pushing the limits of its patience.
The stakes go far beyond Philippine sovereignty. The South China Sea is the lifeline of global commerce, carrying an estimated $5.3 trillion worth of trade every year. Tankers carrying oil from the Middle East, container ships bound for Japan, Korea, and the US, fishing fleets supplying protein for millions, all pass through these waters. Every clash, every water cannon blast, every collision forces insurers to raise premiums, compels captains to alter routes, and sends shivers through already fragile supply chains. In other words, when a Chinese destroyer and a Chinese Coast Guard vessel collide trying to block a Filipino cutter, it's not just Manila that pays the price. The world economy feels the shock. Experts warn this is the shape of danger in the Indo-Pacific. Not open war, but 1,000 reckless acts that could trigger one. As M. Reese Bro wrote in The Diplomat, this incident underscores how China's aggressive, unprofessional, and destabilizing approach to securing its illegal maritime claims could quickly spiral out of control. Singaporean scholar Colin Koh of RSIS added bluntly, "It shows how close we are to an incident that triggers a wider diplomatic and military crisis." These aren't exaggerations. They're warnings based on years of watching the gray zone turn darker by the month. And yet, in the middle of this storm, Manila has been unflinching. A senior Philippine security official reminded the public of President Marcos Jr.'s marching orders. Amidst all these coercive and aggressive actions, the guidance from the commander-in-chief is very clear. We will not back down. That resolve is now part of the Philippines' national posture, a message to both its own people and to the world. Sovereignty is not negotiable, even when challenged by a superpower. The August 2025 Scarborough Shoal collision was not simply a maritime mishap. It was a geopolitical shockwave reverberating across the Indo-Pacific. At its heart, the crash tested one of the most important pillars of regional security:
Next day in Washington, a first step is taken in the direction demanded by Dewey as the United States and the Philippines.
The U.S.-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty of 1951. The question was blunt. If Chinese aggression escalated beyond water cannons and blocking maneuvers, would Washington stand shoulder to shoulder with Manila? The answer came within days. The U.S. Navy dispatched 2 warships to conduct a freedom of navigation operation, FONOP, near Scarborough. It was a deliberate act, a physical manifestation of America's oft-repeated ironclad pledge to defend the Philippines. But reassurance comes with risk. For every U.S. vessel that sails alongside the PCG, the margin for miscalculation narrows. A single collision or misread maneuver no longer just risks Manila and Beijing. It could drag 2 superpowers into direct confrontation.
Rather than tamping down tensions, the Scarborough clash only hardened them. In the weeks following the collision, Beijing doubled down on its gray zone strategy, flooding 2nd Thomas Shoal with a swarm of Coast Guard, naval, and militia ships. This was no routine patrol. It was a calculated move to remind Manila that humiliation at Scarborough would not force China to retreat. Filipino Marines stationed aboard the rusting BRP Sierra Madre suddenly found themselves facing unprecedented pressure, their supply missions harassed at every turn. Instead of a deterrent, the Scarborough collision became fuel for an escalation cycle, where every push from one side demands a sharper counter from the other, inching the region toward a perilous brink. Each skirmish, each blockade, each ramming attempt brings with it the risk that an accident could spiral into a conflict no one intended. On the legal and diplomatic battlefield, however, the Philippines found an unexpected advantage. The collision underscored what the 2016 Hague Tribunal ruling had already declared. Scarborough Shoal lies inside the Philippine Exclusive Economic Zone, and China's sweeping 9-dash line has no standing in international law. By filming and publicizing the collision, Manila effectively weaponized the tribunal's decision. The footage was not just evidence of reckless behavior, it was proof that China is willing to defy the very rules of the sea. Every time a Chinese ship fires a water cannon, shines a military-grade laser, or even collides with its own counterpart in reckless maneuvers, it becomes easier for allies and partners to condemn Beijing's actions as violations of the rules-based order. In this sense, Scarborough is no longer just a reef, it has become a courtroom, a stage, and a symbol, and the diplomatic tide is widening.
Today we have, as you've just seen, also signed a statement of intent to pursue a defence cooperation agreement that we will seek to sign this time next year.
In the wake of the August 2025 incident, Australia finalized a new defense pact with Manila, committing to expanded joint patrols, shared training, and logistical cooperation. Japan, already one of the strongest backers of the Philippine Coast Guard, announced it would step up military exercises in Philippine waters and provide greater technical and equipment support. Even beyond traditional allies, countries like Canada, France, and the UK voiced sharper condemnations of Beijing's conduct. What was once a lonely battle between a small archipelagic nation and a superpower is now coalescing into a coalition of resistance. Scarborough Shoal, once just a fishing ground, has transformed into a rallying point for nations determined to resist coercion and preserve freedom of navigation. For Beijing, the irony is cutting. Each aggressive maneuver it launches against the Philippines may win a moment of control at sea, but it simultaneously deepens Manila's alliances and strengthens the very coalition China has long sought to prevent. The more it pushes at Scarborough, the more it ties the Philippines into the web of regional security partnerships, making the shoal not just a site of contestation, but a flashpoint where Beijing's strategy risks backfiring. Scarborough, in short, has become the reef that builds alliances. The August 2025 standoff at Scarborough Shoal, ending in the surreal collision of 2 Chinese ships, is more than a headline. It's a snapshot of the broader South China Sea struggle. On one side is the Philippines, leveraging its strategy of documenting and publicizing every act of harassment, turning transparency into a weapon of diplomacy. On the other side is China, wielding its gray zone tactics of intimidation and escalation, only to expose the recklessness and fragility of its own approach. The incident has proven that Manila's cameras and civilian-led missions can pierce Beijing's narrative and put the spotlight of international law firmly back on China's actions. Looking ahead, the trajectory is dangerous but predictable. China, humiliated by the Scarborough collision, will almost certainly seek to reassert dominance, whether by deploying larger forces, swarming other contested shoals, or expanding its maritime militia. The Philippines, emboldened by both domestic resolve and allied support, will push forward with its assertive, civilian-backed resupply missions, refusing to yield even under pressure. And caught between these strategies is the constant risk that another miscalculation, a ramming, a collision, or even a live-fire exchange, could spark a wider confrontation that drags in regional and global powers. The spiral of escalation is already visible. In the end, the South China Sea has become a high-stakes game of chicken, played not only for reefs and fishing grounds, but for the credibility of the international system itself. The world is watching. Will China's disregard for international law and pursuit of sweeping, ahistorical claims be met with a sustained and unified pushback? Or will the region continue to live under the shadow of coercion, where peace is held hostage by a great power's ambition? The answer will shape not just the fate of the Philippines or the waters of Scarborough, but the stability of the entire Indo-Pacific and perhaps the future of global order itself.
If you liked the video, do not forget to like, share, and subscribe our channel for deep analysis of contemporary issues. What happens when the world's busiest trade highway turns into a naval chessboard? That's the question hanging heavy over Asia right now. In the latest jolt of breaking news, Chinese warships and Coast Guard vessels have surged back into contested waters of the South China Sea, shadowing U.S. naval activity and circling flashpoints like Scarborough Shoal. One regional security official summed it up bluntly: this is no longer signaling, this is positioning. And suddenly, Manila is on high alert, allies are dialing each other up, and the calm blue waters are starting to look dangerously crowded. Picture this for a second, a stretch of sea carrying nearly $3 trillion in global trade every year, now packed with destroyers, patrol ships, and combat aircraft flying too close for comfort. This isn't some distant maritime dispute, it's the route your fuel, food, electronics, and energy supplies travel through. Scarborough Shoal, just a short sail from the Philippine coast, has once again become ground zero, with China flexing power and the Philippines responding by tightening coordination with the United States and regional partners. One wrong move here doesn't just make headlines, it rewrites security equations. And that's why this moment hits different. This isn't about one patrol or one provocation, it's about who controls the rules of the sea. Beijing's deployments challenge freedom of navigation, test international law, and directly push back against U.S. presence in the Indo-Pacific. For the Philippines, it's an uncomfortable reminder that sovereignty isn't abstract. It's defended in real time, under real pressure. The South China Sea is no longer simmering in the background. It's boiling, and the world is watching to see who blinks first. All right, let's set the stage properly because none of this is random, and none of it started yesterday. The South China Sea has been contested for decades, long before today's headlines and warship movements. China, the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and Taiwan all lay overlapping claims to islands, reefs, and waters in this strategically priceless maritime zone. On paper, many of these claims are supposed to be governed by the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which defines territorial waters, exclusive economic zones, and maritime rights. In reality, power politics often outweigh legal diagrams. What should be clear-cut lines on a map have turned into gray zones patrolled by coast guards, naval vessels, and surveillance aircraft.
What you see on the screen is a depiction of the South China Sea, and you see the red dashes around the perimeter of the South China Sea.
The tension exploded into legal warfare in 2016, when an international arbitral tribunal in The Hague delivered a landmark ruling in favor of the Philippines. The court decisively struck down China's sweeping 9-line claim, declaring it had no legal basis under UNCLOS. For Manila, the verdict was a diplomatic weapon, proof that international law was on its side. For Beijing, it was a red line. China rejected the ruling outright, calling it null and void, and has since acted as if it never existed. That legal standoff still defines today's confrontations. The Philippines cites the ruling in protests and speeches, while Chinese ships continue operating as if the map never changed. Layered on top of this is the constant presence of the United States Navy, which views the South China Sea not as a regional dispute, but as a global test case. Through regular freedom of navigation operations (FNOP), U.S. warships deliberately sail near contested features, including recent patrols close to Scarborough Shoal, to challenge what Washington calls excessive maritime claims. The message is old school but crystal clear: the seas stay open, no matter who tries to fence them off. As U.S. officials put it, these missions defend the right to fly, sail, and operate wherever international law allows. And every time an American ship shows up, Chinese vessels shadow it, turning the South China Sea into a high-stakes standoff where law, history, and raw power collide. Now here's where things get real, because this isn't just talk anymore, it's steel in the water and aircraft in the sky. Over the past few days, China has rolled out serious naval and air power into waters claimed by the Philippines. And the composition of these forces matters. Guided missile destroyers and frigates, not symbolic patrol boats, have been tracked operating close to sensitive areas, signaling high-end combat readiness rather than routine law enforcement presence. These platforms are built for air defense, anti-ship warfare, and long-range operations. Meaning, this deployment is designed to be seen, noted, and calculated by everyone watching the radar screens. Even more eye-catching is the aerial component. China has flown H-6 strategic bombers, aircraft capable of carrying YJ-12 supersonic anti-ship missiles with an estimated strike range of up to 500 kilometers. That's not defensive posturing, that's a clear reminder of reach. From those distances, major naval formations, ports, and sea lanes fall well within potential engagement zones. In simple terms, Beijing is quietly saying, we can hit far, and we can hit fast. Officially, China's Southern Theater Command is playing it cool. The patrols are described as routine, while Manila is accused of colluding with external forces, diplomatic shorthand for working too closely with the United States and its allies. According to Beijing, these deployments are meant to preserve peace and stability. It's a familiar script: assert dominance, deny escalation, blame the other side. Old playbook, new hardware. At the core, China's stated objective remains unchanged. Beijing insists it is defending territorial sovereignty and responding to what it calls provocations by rival claimants and outside powers meddling in regional affairs. But the scale and sophistication of the forces involved tell a deeper story. This isn't just about protecting claims. It's about shaping behavior, intimidating opponents, and setting red lines in real time. In the South China Sea, China isn't asking for attention anymore. It's commanding it. Washington didn't waste time responding, and it responded the way it always has, by showing up, staying visible, and refusing to blink. The U.S. Navy has surged Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers alongside littoral combat ships into waters near disputed shoals, reinforcing what officials call a persistent presence in the South China Sea. These aren't ceremonial sail-bys. Arleigh Burkes are among the most capable surface combatants afloat, packed with Aegis air defense systems, cruise missiles, and anti-submarine warfare capabilities. Their deployment sends a quiet but unmistakable signal. the US, is prepared to operate in contested waters and stay there. At the heart of this posture is freedom of navigation operations, a doctrine Washington treats almost like sacred tradition. US officials stress that these operations are fully consistent with international law and not aimed at any single country, even if everyone knows who's being challenged. One Pentagon spokesperson cut straight through the noise, stating that China's maritime claims do not deter us. In plain terms, the message is simple and old school. No nation gets to rewrite the rules of the sea by force. But beneath the tough talk lies a very real danger. The South China Sea has already seen near misses, aggressive shadowing, and even collisions between Chinese vessels during high-speed maneuvers. Add American warships, Chinese destroyers, bombers overhead, and Coast Guard vessels weaving between them, and the margin for error shrinks fast. A misjudged turn, a misread radar contact, or an overly aggressive intercept could trigger a crisis no one actually planned for. That's the uncomfortable truth of the current US posture. Deterrence keeps the peace until it doesn't. And in these crowded waters, where pride, power, and patrol routes collide, escalation doesn't need intent. It only needs one bad moment. For Manila, this isn't theory or great power abstraction. This is happening right off its coast, and the response has been sharp, public, and deliberate. The Philippine government has moved quickly on the diplomatic front, issuing official protests and lodging firm representations with the Chinese embassy over both Beijing's rhetoric and its expanding maritime presence. Philippine officials have pushed back hard against accusations of collusion, stressing that defending sovereign rights is not provocation. In statements from Malacanang and the Department of Foreign Affairs, the message is consistent. China's actions are being challenged on record, in writing, and through international channels. No quiet acceptance, no silent retreat. At sea, the posture has tightened. The Philippine Navy and Philippine Coast Guard have stepped up patrols across the West Philippine Sea, keeping a closer watch on contested areas and maintaining presence near sensitive features. While Manila knows it cannot match China ship for ship, visibility itself has become a form of resistance. Each patrol shows the same point: these waters are not abandoned, and sovereignty isn't surrendered just because the other side is bigger. Diplomatically, the Philippines is also playing the long game. Coordination with the United States remains central, especially through joint exercises, intelligence sharing, and operational planning under existing defense agreements. At the same time, Manila continues engaging ASEAN partners, pushing for unity, consultations, and a rules-based approach to maritime security. It's a careful balancing act, strengthening alliances without triggering outright escalation. The Philippine response is quiet but firm, cautious but unmistakable. Manila isn't pounding the table, but it isn't backing down either. In a region where silence can be mistaken for consent, the Philippines is making one thing clear: it's present, it's watching, and it intends to stand its ground. What's unfolding in the South China Sea doesn't stay neatly boxed inside national borders, it ripples across the entire region. For ASEAN, these tensions are a stress test of unity. Some member states are deeply uneasy about being dragged into a confrontation between major powers, preferring quiet diplomacy and strategic ambiguity. Others, especially claimant states, are increasingly vocal about the need to push back against coercive behavior before it becomes the new normal. The result is a familiar Asian dilemma: consensus versus credibility. Every flare-up exposes how hard it is to speak with one voice when national interests, threat perceptions, and economic ties to China all pull in different directions. The economic stakes raise the temperature even further. The South China Sea isn't just geopolitically sensitive, it's economically indispensable. These waters carry critical shipping lanes and energy routes that feed East Asian manufacturing hubs, fuel markets, and consumer supply chains. Any serious disruption whether from military standoffs or heightened insurance risks, would ripple straight into ports, prices, and production lines. For economies built on just-in-time trade, even short-term instability can translate into long-term uncertainty. Then there's the most immediate danger: maritime safety. The sea is getting crowded, and not just with warships. Military vessels, Coast Guard cutters, and maritime militia are operating in close quarters, often at high speed and under political pressure. Each aggressive maneuver, each shadowing incident, raises the odds of an accident, and in this environment, accidents don't stay accidents for long. One collision, one misread intention, and the region could find itself in an escalatory spiral no one planned for, but everyone would have to deal with. In short, the South China Sea is becoming more than a dispute zone, it's a regional fault line. And the longer tensions simmer, the harder it becomes for Asian, markets, and mariners alike to pretend this is business as usual. At the core of all this naval muscle flexing is a much quieter battlefield, international law, and that fight may be the most consequential of all. The legal backbone of the South China Sea disputes is the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Under UNCLOS, coastal states are granted clearly defined maritime entitlements, including territorial seas and exclusive economic zones extending up to 200 nautical miles. This framework is what anchors the Philippines' legal position in the West Philippine Sea. Manila argues that its claims aren't based on power or history, but on codified international law that most of the world recognizes and follows. In theory, UNCLOS is supposed to remove ambiguity. In practice, it's become the very thing being contested. China, however, plays by a different script. Beijing asserts historical rights that it argues predate UNCLOS and justify its extensive presence and deployments across much of the South China Sea. This interpretation has been widely challenged, especially after the 2016 arbitral ruling, but China continues to treat these claims as non-negotiable. From Beijing's perspective, patrols, exercises, and ship deployments are not violations. They are enforcement of long-held sovereignty. Law, in this view, bends to history and power. The United States cuts straight across that argument. Washington insists that freedom of navigation and overflight are protected under UNCLOS norms and customary international law, regardless of competing sovereignty claims. That's the legal logic behind U.S. freedom of navigation operations. They are not about ownership of reefs or shoals, but about preventing any single state from turning international waters into restricted zones. Every FONOP is a legal statement made with a warship. And that's the real tension. One side sees law as fixed rules, the other treats it as flexible history. Until those visions align or one clearly prevails, the South China Sea will remain not just a military standoff, but a legal one, fought ship by ship, patrol by patrol. When you strip away the press statements and naval posturing, what's left is a tense strategic equation, and none of the outcomes are guaranteed to stay tidy. One possible path is de-escalation, driven by sustained diplomacy, military hotlines, and confidence-building measures. This is the scenario everyone publicly claims to want: fewer risky maneuvers, clearer communication, and a return to managed competition. But let's be real, de-escalation in the South China Sea doesn't mean ships go home. It means tensions are contained, not resolved, and restraint becomes a daily operational choice rather than a permanent fix. The more likely near-term scenario is a prolonged standoff. Persistent patrols, shadowing operations, and shows of force continue, but without major incidents. Friction becomes normalized. Each side learns the other's habits, thresholds, and red lines. This kind of frozen confrontation feels stable on the surface, but it's exhausting, expensive, and inherently fragile. One political crisis elsewhere or one aggressive captain at sea can shatter the balance overnight. The most dangerous scenario is escalation, and the scary part is that it wouldn't have to be intentional. An unintended collision, an aircraft intercept gone wrong,
or a misinterpreted radar lock could trigger rapid military responses before diplomacy has time to catch up. In an environment thick with nationalism and alliance commitments, even a minor incident can spiral faster than leaders can control. Complicating all of this is the accelerating technological edge. Advanced missile platforms, long-range strike systems, real-time surveillance drones, and networked sensors are compressing decision-making timelines. Commanders now see more, track faster, and react quicker, which sounds stabilizing until it isn't. Speed reduces room for human judgment, and in contested waters, that can turn seconds into strategic consequences. Bottom line, the South China Sea isn't drifting toward resolution, it's hardening into a test of endurance, discipline, and crisis management. The danger isn't war by design, it's war by miscalculation, and history tells us that's often how the worst ones start. Zoom out for a second, and it's obvious the South China Sea isn't just about reefs and shoals anymore, it's a front line in the US-China strategic rivalry. Every patrol, every statement, every joint exercise feeds into a much larger contest over influence, credibility, and leadership in the Indo-Pacific. For Washington, presence equals commitment to allies, to international law, to an open maritime order. For Beijing, pushing back is about reshaping that order and proving it can no longer be dictated from outside the region. The result? Alliances are tightening, defense cooperation is deepening, and neutral ground is getting harder to find. Multilateral diplomacy is supposed to be the pressure valve, but progress has been painfully slow. UN platforms and related mechanisms offer space for dialogue, confidence building, and rule setting. Yet consensus remains elusive. Competing interests, economic dependencies, and strategic caution keep outcomes watered down. The long-discussed code of conduct in the South China Sea, for example, moves forward inch by inch, always discussed, never quite delivered. Still, these forums matter. In a crisis-prone environment, even slow diplomacy is better than silence. That's why dialogue, however imperfect, remains essential. Military deterrence may prevent immediate conflict, but only sustained diplomatic engagement and respect for international norms can prevent long-term instability. Hotlines, maritime communication protocols, and regular consultations don't solve sovereignty disputes, but they can stop misunderstandings from turning into flashpoints. In a region this tense, talking is not weakness, it's damage control. What we're witnessing now is a clear escalation in geopolitical intensity. China's expanded naval deployments, the United States' firm maritime posture, and the Philippines' heightened state of alert all point to a South China Sea that is more contested, more crowded, and more consequential than ever. This isn't a temporary spike, it's a new normal taking shape in real time. The risks are obvious and serious. Military operations intersect with strategic rivalry and unresolved legal claims, creating a volatile mix where miscalculation could carry regional, even global consequences. Trade routes, energy flows, alliance credibility, and international law are all on the line. When great power competition plays out at sea, the margin for error is dangerously thin. The path forward is narrow but clear. Stronger diplomacy, greater transparency, and consistent adherence to lawful maritime conduct are no longer optional. They're essential. The South China Sea has always been a crossroads of commerce and culture. Whether it becomes a corridor of cooperation or a theater of confrontation depends on the choices being made right now, while the ships are still maneuvering and the lines are not yet crossed.
The harassment of the Philippine Coast Guard vessel, this is not just an harassment on the Philippine government. This is actually a mockery to the international law, to the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea.
What does it mean for a small coastal patrol boat to stand its course when a much larger vessel cuts across its bow? In the West Philippine Sea, this is no longer a hypothetical question. It is a daily reality. As dawn breaks over contested waters, Filipino sailors, fishermen, and Coast Guard crews operate under constant pressure, fully aware that a single maneuver, a single miscalculation, could echo far beyond the horizon. This is not just a maritime dispute. It is a test of resolve, legality, and national dignity. The West Philippine Sea, part of the broader South China Sea through which more than $3 trillion in global trade passes each year, has become one of the most closely watched geopolitical flashpoints in the Indo-Pacific. Chinese Coast Guard vessels patrol aggressively, maritime militia swarm disputed features, and water cannons replace warning shots. These are gray zone tactics, actions calibrated to intimidate without triggering open conflict. Yet for the Philippines, the consequences are anything but abstract. Fishermen are driven from traditional grounds. Resupply missions face obstruction. Sovereign rights recognized under international law are challenged in real time on real waters. What makes the Philippine case distinct is not merely geography, but response. Unlike some Southeast Asian states that have opted for quiet accommodation or strategic ambiguity, Manila has increasingly chosen visibility and law. Where others remain silent, the Philippines files diplomatic protests. Where others de-escalate through disengagement, Manila documents incidents, releases footage, and invokes international rulings. This contrast matters. Vietnam fortifies quietly. Malaysia avoids public confrontation. Cambodia aligns politically. The Philippines, by comparison, has taken the harder path, absorbing pressure while insisting that rules, not power, must govern the sea.
All we are doing is resupplying our fishermen, protecting our territorial rights. Again, it will be provocative, it will be seen as an escalation. We don't do that. The Philippines does not escalate tension. Why the opposite? The Philippines always tries to bring down the level of tension.
At the heart of this stance is a simple but profound choice: to defend sovereignty without militarizing the dispute, to resist coercion without provoking war. By anchoring its strategy in international law, diplomatic signaling, and strengthened alliances, particularly with the United States and regional partners, the Philippines is attempting something rare in modern geopolitics. It is showing that a middle power, even under sustained pressure from a far stronger adversary, can stand its ground without abandoning restraint. This is the story of how the Philippines is navigating one of the most dangerous waterways in the world, not with bravado, but with persistence. Not with force alone, but with principle. And in an era where might often seems to make right, that choice may prove more consequential than any single encounter at sea. For the Philippines, the dispute in the West Philippine Sea did not begin with warships or water cannons. It began with maps, coastlines, and rules agreed upon by nearly the entire world. Under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, coastal states are entitled to a 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone, measured from their shores. For Manila, this is not an abstract legal concept. It defines where Filipino fishermen can work, where energy resources may be developed, and where the state exercises sovereign rights. The West Philippine Sea falls squarely within this framework, anchored to geography, not ambition. China's claim follows a very different logic. Through the so-called 9-dash line, Beijing asserts historic rights over nearly the entire South China Sea, an area stretching thousands of kilometers from the Chinese mainland and overlapping the EEZs of multiple Southeast Asian states. Unlike UNCLOS-based claims, the 9-dash line is not tied to coastlines, distances, or modern maritime law. It is deliberately vague, historically selective, and strategically expansive. That ambiguity has been its strength. flexible enough to justify patrols, pressure, and presence without ever clearly defining legal limits.
The new government here in Manila is grappling with what might be called catastrophic success. What comes next is obviously going to be a delicate balancing act. It is a time for cool heads, and Manila is sensibly, I think, being careful not to flaunt its legal victory. It's very important at this stage not to do anything that could give China a pretext for escalation.
This clash between law and assertion came to a head in 2016. In a landmark case brought by the Philippines, an international arbitral tribunal operating under the Permanent Court of Arbitration issued a sweeping ruling. The tribunal concluded that China's historic claims had no legal basis under international law, and affirmed that features such as reefs and low tide elevations could not generate expansive maritime entitlements. Just as importantly, it upheld the Philippines' sovereign rights within its EEZ. For Manila, the ruling was not a victory lap, it was a legal anchor. For Beijing, it was rejected outright. What followed revealed the deeper pattern. Rather than retreat, China accelerated its presence. Over the past decade, submerged reefs and coral outcrows were transformed into artificial islands, complete with runways, radar systems, missile shelters, and hardened facilities. These were not civilian projects. They were permanent fixtures of power projection, designed to normalize Chinese control and shift facts on the water faster than diplomacy or legal mechanisms could respond. Each new structure quietly altered the balance, turning contested spaces into monitored, defended zones. This history matters because it explains the present moment. The Philippines is not reacting to a sudden crisis. It is responding to a long-running strategy that blends lawfare, infrastructure, and coercion. And unlike states that have chosen silence or accommodation, Manila continues to point back to the same foundation: geography, international law, and a ruling that still stands, even if one side refuses to acknowledge it. In an era where rules are increasingly tested by power, that insistence has become an act of strategic resistance in itself. The importance of the West Philippine Sea is not measured only in nautical miles or legal charts. It is measured in movement. Every day, some of the world's largest container ships, energy tankers, and bulk carriers pass through these waters. Linking factories in East Asia to markets in Europe, the Middle East, and beyond. More than $3 trillion in global trade flows through this corridor annually, making it one of the busiest and most consequential maritime highways on the planet. Control, influence, or disruption here does not stay local. It ripples outward, affecting supply chains, prices, and economic stability far from Southeast Asia. This is why the West Philippine Sea carries weight far beyond Philippine shores. What happens here shapes the broader security environment of Association of Southeast Asian Nations, where smaller states closely watch whether international law can still protect them from coercion. It also directly affects extra-regional powers. For the United States and its allies, freedom of navigation through these waters underpins military mobility and commercial access. For the European Union, whose economies depend heavily on uninterrupted maritime trade, instability threatens economic exposure. In short, the West Philippine Sea is a pressure point where regional disputes intersect with global balance. Yet the most immediate impact is felt not by strategists in capitals, but by fishing communities along the Philippine coast. For generations, Filipino fishers relied on these waters as a source of food and income. Today, many report returning home with empty nets after being crowded out by larger foreign vessels, or deterred by the constant presence of Coast Guard ships.
The numbers reflect that reality. The West Philippine Sea's contribution to the country's total fish supply has reportedly fallen from around 7% to 5%, a seemingly small shift that carries serious consequences for food security, prices, and rural livelihoods. For coastal families, geopolitics shows up not as headlines, but as lost income and uncertainty about tomorrow's catch. Beneath the surface lies another layer of strategic value: energy. Geological surveys suggest that the seabed of the West Philippine Sea holds potential offshore oil and gas reserves that could help reduce the Philippines' long-standing dependence on imported fuel. For a country vulnerable to energy price shocks, these resources represent long-term strategic insurance if they can be accessed and developed responsibly. But exploration itself has become politicized. Survey ships are challenged, projects are delayed, and uncertainty discourages investment. What should be a question of energy planning has become entangled in power competition. These factors explain why the West Philippine Sea matters so deeply and why Manila's stance resonates beyond its borders. This is not simply a territorial dispute over distant reefs. It is about who gets to fish, who controls energy futures, and whether global trade routes remain governed by rules or by pressure. The strategic significance of these waters lies precisely in that convergence, where everyday livelihoods, national resilience, and international order all meet in the same stretch of sea. Faced with sustained pressure at sea, the Philippines has chosen an approach that is deliberate rather than dramatic. Diplomacy remains the first line of response. Manila continues to work within ASEAN to keep the dispute anchored to international law, consistently emphasizing adherence to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea and the 2016 arbitral ruling. This is not easy diplomacy. Consensus within ASEAN is often slow and uneven. Yet the Philippines persists because multilateral visibility limits China's ability to isolate or quietly pressure individual states. When incidents occur, Manila does not let them pass unnoticed. Diplomatic protests, formal demarches are filed with regularity, creating a documented record of coercive behavior. These protests are not symbolic paperwork. They are strategic signals that incidents will be named, recorded, and internationalized. After confrontations near Sabina, Shoal Philippine officials were unusually direct. Defense Secretary Gilberto Teodoro described Chinese actions as dangerous and inhumane, showing that restraint does not mean silence. The message was clear. Pressure will be met with exposure, not acquiescence. Behind the scenes, legal preparation continues methodically. Philippine government agencies now operate on the assumption that documentation itself is a form of deterrence. Incursions are logged, radio challenges recorded, video footage preserved, and incident timelines reconstructed. This evidence feeds diplomatic engagements today and preserves options for legal action tomorrow. The lesson of 2016 was not that courts solve disputes overnight, but that law provides leverage over time, especially when power asymmetries are sharp. At the same time, Manila has moved to narrow the gap between legal position and physical presence. Military and maritime preparedness have accelerated, particularly for the Navy and Coast Guard. Patrols have increased. Surveillance coverage has expanded. The goal is not escalation, but persistence. To ensure that Philippine vessels remain present in waters they are legally entitled to operate in. This presence is reinforced through regular joint exercises with allies, most notably with the United States during Balikatan. These drills improve interoperability, signal alliance credibility, and quietly raise the cost of coercion without firing a shot. Equally important is the domestic front.
The Philippine government has invested more effort in public communication, briefings, footage releases, educational campaigns aimed at building national understanding of maritime rights.
This is not propaganda, it is resilience building. When citizens understand why distant shoals matter, political resolve becomes harder to erode. Public awareness turns external pressure into a shared national issue, rather than a niche security concern. Taken together, the Philippines' response reflects a strategic posture shaped by realism. Manila cannot outmatch China ship for ship, but it can outlast coercion by combining law, alliances, documentation, and public resolve. It is a strategy built for endurance rather than headlines, and in a dispute defined by patience and pressure, that may be the most effective response of all.
Sa ngayon, nagbuga na naman ng tubig ang water.
The dispute in the West Philippine Sea has steadily evolved from a bilateral tension into a regional litmus test. Within the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, Manila has emerged as one of the most vocal advocates for unity against unilateral changes to the maritime status quo. The Philippines consistently pushes the idea that silence only accelerates normalization of coercion.
Nabidyohan ko po, nabidyohan ko.
Yet ASEAN consensus remains fragile. Several member states balance maritime concerns against deep economic ties with China, making collective action uneven and often cautious. The result is a region aware of the risk, but divided over how openly to confront it.
Beyond Southeast Asia, the implications widen quickly. The credibility of international maritime law is at stake, particularly the principle of freedom of navigation. In response to expansive claims, the United States and like-minded partners continue to conduct freedom of navigation operations, challenging what they describe as excessive maritime assertions. These patrols are not about territorial ownership, they are about precedent. If restrictions imposed in the West Philippine Sea go unchallenged, similar tactics could appear elsewhere, from the Indian Ocean to critical choke points in Europe. For this reason, developments off Philippine shores are closely monitored in Washington, Brussels, Tokyo, and Canberra. Despite its principled stance, the Philippines operates under clear constraints. Militarily, the imbalance is stark. China's Navy and Coast Guard possess far greater numbers, larger hulls, and more advanced systems. This reality limits Manila's ability to rely on unilateral force and reinforces its dependence on alliances and partnerships for deterrence and strategic depth. Presence can be sustained, but escalation control requires external support. Diplomatically, the balancing act is equally delicate. China remains a major trading partner and investor, giving Beijing economic leverage alongside maritime pressure. Philippine policymakers must therefore calibrate responses carefully, asserting sovereignty without triggering economic retaliation or closing diplomatic channels. This is not appeasement. It is risk management in an environment where missteps carry national consequences. At home, expectations are rising. Public awareness of maritime issues has grown sharply, fueled by media coverage and official disclosures. With that awareness comes pressure. Citizens increasingly demand visible protection of sovereignty, even as they fear the costs of open conflict. Political leadership must navigate this tension, projecting firmness without feeding instability and resolve without recklessness. Looking ahead, Manila's strategy points toward endurance rather than sudden transformation. Defense and surveillance enhancements remain a priority. Investments in maritime domain awareness, radar coverage, unmanned systems, satellite integration,
and upgraded Coast Guard assets are designed to improve visibility and persistence rather than provoke confrontation. The objective is simple: to know what happens in Philippine waters and to be present where the law allows. Diplomatically, the Philippines continues to press for a binding code of conduct in the South China Sea, even as negotiations move slowly. At the same time, Manila is deepening strategic relationships beyond its traditional ally. Ties with Japan, Australia, the European Union, and the United States are expanding across defense, capacity building, and political coordination. This diversified network reduces over-reliance on any single partner and embeds the Philippine position within a broader coalition of interest. Equally important is sustainability. Fishing communities remain on the front line of this dispute, and long-term resilience depends on balancing access, conservation, and economic opportunity. Protecting marine ecosystems while adapting livelihoods to shifting realities will be critical, not only for food security, but for maintaining public trust in national strategy.
The West Philippine Sea represents one of the most serious sovereignty challenges the Philippines has faced in recent decades. It is a contest fought simultaneously in courtrooms, diplomatic halls, fishing grounds, and open waters. Through a combination of legal persistence, diplomatic engagement, alliance building, and measured readiness, Manila has chosen a path that resists coercion without abandoning restraint. As tensions persist, the Philippine approach reflects a clear calculation that defending national interests does not require abandoning international norms, and that power alone should not determine outcomes at sea. The West Philippine Sea remains a test of sovereignty, of diplomacy, and of collective resolve. It is a test the Philippines continues to meet not with escalation, but with steady determination anchored in law, partnerships, and national will. If you like the video, do not forget to like, share, and subscribe our channel for deep analysis of contemporary issues.
Well, obviously, they don't want to publicize and tell the world that such collision really happened because they want to save face. They also don't want to show the world that they are not really capable to claim that they are a naval power right now.
Just before sunrise, when the sea is usually calm and quiet, something unusual appeared on the radar screens of Filipino maritime watchers. Not one vessel, not 5, but dozens. 30 Chinese ships moving together across waters the Philippines calls its own. Some were large white-hulled vessels from the China Coast Guard. Others were smaller boats suspected to be part of China's shadowy maritime militia, civilian fishing vessels that often move like a coordinated fleet when tensions rise. To many observers in the Philippines, it didn't look like fishing. It looked like a message, and maybe even a warning. Now here's the question people across Southeast Asia are quietly asking. Was this just another patrol, or the beginning of something bigger? Because if you've been following what's happening in the West Philippine Sea, the section of the broader South China Sea claimed by Manila, you know this isn't just about ships. It's about power, territory, and who gets to decide the rules of the sea. For fishermen from small Philippine coastal towns, these waters are not an abstract geopolitical debate. They are surviving. Generations have sailed these seas long before satellites, coast guards, or international court rulings existed. A Filipino fisherman once described it in a simple way. The sea is our rice field. But in recent years, that rice field has started to feel crowded and sometimes hostile. Chinese vessels have appeared again and again near contested areas like Second Thomas Shoal, where the Philippines maintains a small military outpost aboard the aging ship BRP Sierra Madre. There have been water cannons, dangerous blocking maneuvers, and tense standoffs that play out far from cameras but carry enormous strategic. That number makes people pause. Even officials in Manila described the sighting as unusually large. Some analysts think it could be a test, a way for Beijing to probe how far it can push without triggering a serious response. Others see something more calculated. A slow strategy. Send ships. Increase presence. Normalize the patrols. Repeat it often enough that the world eventually stops noticing. And that's the part that worries many strategists. Because history has shown that control over the sea doesn't always begin with warships or missiles. Sometimes it starts quietly, with fleets that appear again and again until they simply become permanent. That's why this latest swarm of vessels has sparked new questions not only in the Philippines, but across the region, from Vietnam to Malaysia, and even among security planners in the United States. Is this another episode in a long-running maritime dispute? Or are we watching the next stage of a much bigger geopolitical contest unfolding in real time? The truth is, the South China Sea has always been complicated. Claims overlap. Maps disagree. Politics runs deep. But when 30 ships suddenly appear in disputed waters, the question becomes unavoidable. What exactly is China trying to prove, and how far is the Philippines willing to push back? To understand what might happen next, we need to step back and look at the deeper story behind these waters, the legal battles that shaped them, and the strategic game now unfolding across one of the most important seas on Earth. For many people outside Southeast Asia, the name can sound confusing. Is it a different sea, a new claim, or just a political label? In reality, the West Philippine Sea is the name used by the Philippines to describe the portions of the broader South China Sea that fall within its exclusive economic zone, or EEZ. Under international law, that zone stretches about 200 nautical miles from a country's coastline. Within it, a state has the right to explore and use marine resources, fish, oil, natural gas, all of it. And honestly, this isn't some empty patch of ocean. These waters are incredibly valuable. The sea is packed with fishing grounds that have fed coastal communities for generations. Beneath the seabed, geologists believe there may be large deposits of oil and natural gas. And above it all runs one of the busiest maritime highways on the planet. Roughly $3 trillion worth of global trade passes through the wider South China Sea every year. Tankers carrying energy, cargo ships loaded with electronics, the entire global economy quietly depends on these waters staying stable. And that's exactly why every new confrontation feels a little heavier than the last. The fight over the South China Sea didn't suddenly appear overnight. It has been building for decades, like a slow-moving storm. Several countries claim parts of the sea, including Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, Taiwan, and the Philippines. Many of these claims overlap, creating a complicated puzzle of maps, history, and competing national interests. But the biggest claim belongs to China. Beijing uses a controversial boundary known as the 9-dash line, a sweeping U-shaped line that covers almost the entire South China Sea. According to that map, China asserts historic rights over waters that lie much closer to other countries' coastlines. The case became one of the most significant legal battles over maritime law in modern history. The ruling, formerly known as the South China Sea Arbitration, was clear. The tribunal concluded that China's sweeping 9-dash line claim had no legal basis under international law. For Manila, it was a huge diplomatic victory. But Beijing rejected the decision outright and continues to ignore the ruling to this day. Which means the dispute never really ended. It just entered a new phase. If you talk to people in the Philippines, especially those living in coastal communities, the issue doesn't feel like a distant geopolitical chess match. It feels personal. Filipino fishermen have repeatedly reported being chased away from waters their families have fished for decades. Some describe Chinese vessels blocking access to reefs, while others say their boats were shadowed or warned to leave areas they once considered normal fishing grounds. One fisherman from western Luzon once said something that stuck with a lot of people. Our fathers fished here. Our grandfathers too. Suddenly someone tells us it's not ours anymore. That frustration has slowly built into national pressure. Coast Guard ships escort fishing boats, deliver fuel and food, and sometimes carry supplies to remote outposts in contested reefs. It's not always dramatic. Sometimes it's just slow, tense maneuvering between ships under the tropical sun. But every resupply mission, every fishing trip, every patrol carries the same quiet message. The Philippines isn't planning to disappear from these waters. Not now. Not easily. It started with a sight that immediately caught attention inside Philippine maritime monitoring centers. Radar screens began showing clusters of vessels gathering in the West Philippine Sea, far more than what would normally appear during routine fishing activity. As the reports came in, the number became clear: around 30 Chinese ships operating inside waters that the Philippines considers part of its exclusive economic zone. 30 vessels moving together is not something officials simply brush off. Even seasoned observers paused for a moment. One or two ships could easily be explained as patrols or fishing boats drifting through. But 30 moving in proximity suggests coordination. Philippine authorities said several of the vessels were linked to the China Coast Guard, while others appeared to belong to China's maritime militia fleet. Boats that look like ordinary fishing trawlers, but are often used to reinforce Beijing's presence in disputed waters. The locations where they appeared made the situation even more sensitive. Some of the activity was observed near Scarborough Shoal, known locally as Bajo de Masinloc, a reef that has been one of the most symbolic flashpoints between China and the Philippines for years. Other vessels were seen near Pag-asa Island, a small Philippine-held island in the Spratly Chain, where a modest civilian community and a military outpost exist side by side. When ships gather in those places, it is rarely accidental. Every movement carries meaning, whether intended or not. When headlines say Chinese ships, it is easy to imagine a fleet of gray warships sailing together. But the maritime reality in the South China Sea is more layered than that. China usually maintains several types of vessels in contested waters. The most obvious are ships from the People's Liberation Army Navy, the country's formal naval force. These are military warships designed for combat operations, and while they are not always involved directly in these encounters, their presence nearby often signals strategic backing. More commonly seen in daily standoffs are ships from the China Coast Guard. Despite being labeled as law enforcement vessels, many of them are extremely large and heavily equipped. They patrol disputed areas, escort other Chinese vessels, and sometimes position themselves to block or shadow ships from other countries. Then, there is the most unusual layer of China's maritime presence: the maritime militia. These vessels often resemble normal fishing boats. Nets hang from their decks, and from a distance they look like part of any coastal fishing fleet. Yet analysts say many operate in organized formations, maintaining a persistent presence around reefs and islands that Beijing seeks to control. It creates a complicated situation. On paper, they are civilians. In practice, they often function as an extension of state strategy. The reaction from the Philippines has been measured but firm. Officials in Manila increased naval and Coast Guard patrols in the surrounding waters, making sure Philippine vessels maintained visibility in the area. Escort missions for Filipino fishermen were also reinforced. These patrols are meant to ensure that local boats can continue operating without being pushed away from fishing grounds that coastal communities have relied on for generations. Government statements describe the presence of the Chinese ships as illegal and provocative, emphasizing that the waters lie within the Philippines' internationally recognized maritime zone. Yet at the same time, Philippine authorities have tried to avoid actions that might suddenly escalate the situation. leaders within the Philippine Coast Guard have repeatedly emphasized restraint. Aggressive responses such as ramming, water cannon exchanges, or direct confrontations could quickly turn a tense encounter into something far more dangerous. So the approach has been a careful one. Maintain presence, defend rights, but avoid lighting a fuse. The situation has not gone unnoticed outside Southeast Asia. Under the Mutual Defense Treaty 1951, the United States is a formal defense ally of the Philippines. The treaty states that an armed attack on Philippine forces in the Pacific could trigger a mutual response. Because of this alliance, Washington and Manila have increased joint patrols and military exercises in recent years. U.S. naval forces also carry out freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea, aimed at challenging maritime claims that exceed international law. Across Southeast Asia, members of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations have voiced concern about rising tensions, although collective responses have often remained cautious. The region is economically intertwined with China, which makes unified diplomatic pressure difficult. Still, the appearance of 30 ships in disputed waters sends a signal that few governments can ignore. Every such incident becomes another reminder that the South China Sea is not just a regional disagreement over maps. It is an unfolding geopolitical contest, one where every patrol, every fishing trip, and every gathering of ships quietly reshapes the balance of power at sea. At the heart of the dispute is a set of rules that most of the world officially agrees to follow at sea. Those rules come from the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, often shortened to UNCLOS. It's basically the global rulebook for oceans, defining who controls what waters, who can fish where, and how far a country's maritime rights extend. Under UNCLOS, the Philippines has sovereign rights over resources within its exclusive economic zone, which stretches roughly 200 nautical miles from its coastline. Inside that zone, Manila has the legal authority to manage fisheries, explore undersea oil or gas deposits, and regulate economic activity connected to those waters. That's why every time foreign vessels appear inside the West Philippine Sea, the issue immediately becomes more than a simple patrol. If those vessels are operating without permission, especially if they are escorting fishing fleets or maritime militia, it raises serious questions about whether those actions violate the spirit and principles of UNCLOS. And that is exactly where today's tension begins. The legal debate reached a dramatic moment in 2016 when the Philippines took its dispute with China to an international tribunal in The Hague. The case, formerly known as the South China Sea Arbitration, produced one of the most consequential rulings in modern maritime law. The tribunal concluded that China's sweeping claim over most of the South China Sea, represented by the controversial 9-dash line, had no legal basis under UNCLOS. For Manila, the decision reinforced its maritime rights and clarified that many of the waters Beijing claims actually fall within the Philippine EEZ. But the ruling did not magically resolve the conflict. China rejected the tribunal's authority and has never recognized the decision, insisting that its activities in the region are legitimate patrols and law enforcement operations. That refusal leaves the international legal victory somewhat incomplete. The law may be clear, but enforcement in international waters often depends on diplomacy, power, and persistence. With the legal framework established but still contested in practice, the Philippines has had to rely on a mix of diplomatic strategies. One path involves direct dialogue with Beijing. Bilateral talks between Manila and Beijing sometimes aim to reduce tensions, manage fishing access, or prevent dangerous incidents at sea. These conversations can be slow and complicated, but they remain one of the few ways to lower tensions without escalation. Another channel runs through the regional bloc known as the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. ASEAN has long attempted to negotiate rules of behavior in the South China Sea, including proposals for a formal code of conduct. The challenge, however, is that ASEAN members have very different relationships with China.